Is a journalist. He joins me from Rome to discuss this. Eric, good to have you on this news hour.
Thank you.
Are the main issues in this vote going to see those opposed to the far right coming out to vote to ensure that the far right does not win? Or will people also be looking at other issues like the rising cost of living?
Well, in the past, what's happened every time there's been a challenge from the far right in France is that the other parties have joined together to try to prevent that from happening. That's happened in 2002, it happened in 2017, 2019. But each time it's less successful, and analysts I've talked to in the lead up to this vote in France say that it may not work this time around. I think that is President Macron's bet that he's making, but it's not necessarily the case. I think that there are a lot of trends that are moving in favor of the right of center parties in Europe these days.
And Macron himself is not very popular in France right now. Of course, these elections were a snap election. They came as a surprise for almost everyone. Do you think Macron is going to base his campaigning purely on voters going out to say no to the far right? What is he offering the French public?
Well, he at the recent G7 that just took place in Italy, he was championing some French priorities. I think he's trying to look like a statesman, well respected internationally. That may help his chances to some extent. But I think that the large sentiment that is shifting the population in Europe to the right, we've seen the same thing in Germany, we've seen the same thing in Netherlands. Italy has had a right-wing party running the government for nearly 2 years. I think those things are working against him, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. But I think probably the most likely outcome in France is that President Macron will stay on, but his prime minister will have to be a compromise candidate from one of the right-wing parties.
Yeah, you mentioned all those countries that are seeing a rise in far-right support, Germany, Netherlands, Italy, which of course has Giorgia Meloni as the prime minister. And it's interesting that most of those countries are also the biggest economy in Europe and have higher migration levels than other parts of Europe. With the far-right growing at this point, at some point, do people expect them to eventually lead completely in France? And what does that then mean for the French going forward?
Well, there's no election in France until 2027. And so if President Macron wants to stay on until then, he can. There is a theory that says he may step down if he loses badly in the elections the second round will take place in early July. But most likely he'll stay on. Now, I'm sorry, my dog is barking here. But in terms of the right gaining more power, the right-wing parties did pick up some seats in the European Parliament in the recent election, and I think that we're going to see a trend in that direction for a while. Remember, this is not even just a European thing. This is the same thing is happening in the U.S. And so I think we can see a gradual rise, but the institutions of the establishment powers on the centrists and the Greens and the left wing are still controlling the European Parliament, and I think most of the decision making will still be made by those groups. But we're bound to see more decisions being made with the right wing priorities taken into account.
Eric Lyman, thanks so much for joining us, speaking to us there from Rome.